Chapter 1. Falling as a starting point. There's a moment when you're lying on the floor thinking, is this the bottom? Or am I still falling? Mark Sokoloff lay on the cold tile of a Warsaw apartment at 3 in the morning, and the only things he could hear were his own breathing and the hum of the refrigerator from the next room. His right eye was swelling shut. His lower lip was split. On the kitchen table stood a glass of water he'd never gotten to drink, because it was at that table, an hour ago, that he'd been struck by the man he'd considered his best friend. His phone lay nearby, screen black, not a single unread message. This hadn't been the first blow of the evening. The first was the one Mark hadn't seen coming, verbal, quiet, delivered in a voice almost without inflection. I'm working with Greg. We signed a contract 3 weeks ago. Your share transfers to him. And only then the fist, because Mark hadn't held himself back after all, and had reached for the laptop to check the files. The files were gone. The folder was empty. 3 years of work vanished. He tried to stand. Didn't make it on the first attempt. Or the second. On the third he made it to the wall, pressed his back against it and just sat there, staring at a crack in the ceiling he'd only noticed now. It had probably always been there. He'd just never lain low enough to see it. Outside, Warsaw wasn't sleeping. The lights of Alage Jerozolimsky flickered through the uncurtained window. Somewhere below, a group of people were laughing, young voices, light, unburdened. Mark closed his eyes. All right, he thought. Then that's where we begin. Chapter 2. The world before, or how something real gets built. 3 years ago, Mark Sokoloff arrived in Warsaw with a backpack, a laptop, and an idea he'd been carrying around in his head since his university days. The idea was simple and audacious at the same time. A platform for freelance translators from Eastern Europe that cut out the middlemen and gave them direct access to the Western European market. No agencies, no 30% commissions, no bureaucracy. Just work and fair pay. He called it *Bridgeword. Mark was not a genius. He knew that about himself. He had no technical education. He'd studied linguistics in Krakow, then spent 2 years working as a courier in Berlin while taking online courses in product development and marketing on the side. He did everything slowly, sometimes clumsily, sometimes over again. But he did it. What he did have was charm, and the ability to listen to people in a way that made them trust him before they even realized it was happening. Taxi drivers told him about their families. Waitresses told him about careers that never panned out. Potential clients told him about their pain points, the ones they'd never voiced to consultants charging €1,000 an hour. Mark listened and remembered. It was his superpower, though he never called it that out loud, too pretentious. He met Dennis Koval at a networking event in a co-working space on Kmielna Street. Dennis was standing by the window with a coffee, talking on the phone in Polish with a slight Ukrainian accent. Fast, confident, with that particular intonation of someone accustomed to being listened to. Tall, well-dressed, wearing a watch that cost more than Mark earned in a month. You're making the face of someone who just figured out how to borrow money from me, said Dennis, finishing his call and turning toward Mark. Mark laughed. No, I'm making the face of someone who needs a co-founder. They talked for 4 hours. Then another 3 the following day. Dennis could do what Mark couldn't. He saw money where others saw ideas. He knew how to package a pitch, how to talk to investors, how to structure a legal framework so it could operate across 3 countries at once. And he had connections. Real ones, living, useful. 6 months later, they registered the company. A year after that, they closed their first round, €80,000 from a small Warsaw fund. 2 years in, the platform was operating in 4 countries. They had 40 corporate clients and nearly 800 translators in the database. Throughout all of it, Mark kept thinking, this is its star. This is what it was worth coming here for. This is what it was all worth. And then Asia entered his life. Anastasia Vronska worked at one of their first corporate clients, a law firm in Mokoto. She handled operations, spoke 5 languages, and looked at the world with the particular squint of someone who had understood too early that most people were pretending. They first saw each other at a presentation for her bosses. Mark stumbled on the 3rd slide. He'd forgotten the name of one of the firm's partners. Asia quietly wrote it on a sticky note in marker and slid it across the table toward him without looking up. After the meeting, he stopped her in the hallway. "Thank you for saving my life. It was just a presentation. For you, just a presentation. For me, everything." She looked at him, praising, then said, "You exaggerate. It shows. Occupational hazard." She smiled. Barely, but she smiled. They started seeing each other 3 weeks later. Mark fell quickly and completely, the way he did everything, without a plan, with full commitment and full vulnerability. Asia was different. She entered feelings cautiously, like cold water, 1 centimeter at a time. But once she was in, it was real. On Sundays they went to the market at Plaxembica, buying too much cheese and too little common sense. She read him Polish poets aloud. He made borscht from his grandmother's recipe and invariably added too much garlic. "Someday I'll show you Krakow," he would say. "There's a place by the river." "Someday is not a time," she would answer. Then next week, she would look at him and say nothing. But she stayed. Chapter 3. The crack. The one you don't want to see. The first sign appeared 8 months ago. Mark noticed that Dennis had started holding meetings without him. Not all of them. Not openly. Just occasionally a client would mention something in conversation that Mark knew nothing about. Some arrangement, some parameter of a future partnership. And when Mark asked Dennis about it, Dennis would brush it off. Just a working detail, didn't get around to telling you, nothing important. Mark believed him. Because he wanted to believe. Because 3 years of working together wasn't just business. It was a history. It was late nights over pitches, shared failures and small victories, coffee at 7 in the morning and conversations at midnight about who you wanted to become. He didn't want to see the crack, so he didn't look directly at it. Asia saw it. "Dennis is doing something behind your back," she said one evening. No preamble, no softening. "You don't like him, you're not being objective." "Mark." She set down her book, looked at him. "I'm not talking about feelings. I'm talking about a pattern." "What pattern?" "Meetings without you. Legal documents he asks you to sign without reading. Clients who call him directly, even though they started out working with you." He stood up, walked across the room. "This is a partnership, Asia. We divide up the tasks." She went quiet, picked up her book again. That was worse than if she'd kept arguing. She'd understood that he wasn't ready to hear it, and she chose silence. Then there was something else. In February, Dennis proposed revising the shareholders' agreement. He said the investors for the second round wanted to see a clearer division of roles. Mark, product and community; Dennis, business development and finance. Technically, on paper, it sounded logical. Mark signed. He read the document. Most of it. He skimmed clause 11.3. There was something about a share transfer mechanism under certain conditions. Legal language, dry and long. He didn't dwell on it. That was his mistake. The one that cost everything. Around the same time, something began to change with Asia too. Not all at once. Gradually. She started responding to messages less often during the day. Started coming home from work later. Once he called her at lunch, she didn't answer, then wrote was in a meeting with a period at the end, and that period felt, to Mark, somehow peculiarly final. He didn't ask directly. He was afraid of the answer. He lived in that particular state of anxiety where you know something is wrong but don't say it aloud. Because as long as it's not named, it's as though it isn't there. In March, she said she needed time to think. Mark asked, "About what?" She said, "About everything." He asked, "Is this about us?" She said, "I don't know, Mark. I really don't know." They spent another 3 weeks together, in that particular state of a relationship that is worse than a breakup. When both of you know but neither one says it. When everything becomes more tender and at the same time more fragile. When every good evening feels like the last. In early April she left. Quietly. Without a scene. She left a note on the kitchen table. 3 sentences. The last one. "You deserve someone who isn't as afraid as I am." Mark read the note 4 times. Folded it. Put it in the desk drawer. Didn't throw it away. Chapter 4. The point of no return. A scene from the past. To understand why Mark didn't leave at once. Why he stayed when everything was telling him run, you have to go back. Not to Warsaw. To Krakow. To the summer he was 17. His father worked as a construction foreman. A good man, strong, quiet, the kind who shows love through deeds, not words. That year he used to take Mark to job sites on weekends. Not because he needed the extra labor, because he wanted to be there with him. There was another worker on the site, Zenon, a man of about 50, shrewd, with a sense of humor and a cigarette perpetually between his teeth. Mark's father trusted him. They'd worked together for 5 years. Zenon knew all the deliveries, all the subcontractors, all the arrangements. In August of that year, the site was inspected. It emerged that a portion of the building materials listed in the budget had disappeared. The money had gone through, the materials hadn't. The documentary responsibility lay with Mark's father. Zenon said nothing. His father lost his job. Then another one, because reputation in that business travels fast. Mark remembered the evening his father came home after being told he was let go. He sat down at the table, poured himself some tea, didn't drink it, just sat and looked out the window. "Dad," Mark said, "did you know he was stealing?" His father was quiet for a moment. Then, "I sensed it, but I thought maybe I was wrong. I didn't want to accuse a man when I wasn't certain. And now? Now I know for certain." Mark never forgot the intonation or the pause. His father didn't cry, didn't get angry, just sat there. And in that sitting was such weariness, such quiet breakage from within, that it was physically painful for Mark to watch. He made himself a promise then. Never, never be the one who knows and stays silent. Never be the one they betray in the quiet. But life puts us precisely into the situations we fear most. And when Mark needed to see, he closed his eyes again. Like his father. From the same blend of trust and fear of being wrong. That is the point of no return. Not the one that happened to him, the one that lives inside us long before. Chapter 5. Silence. When it's all already happened but hasn't yet begun. After Asya left, Mark worked. Not because he wanted to, because work was the only place where his thoughts stopped circling. As long as there was a task, there was a present. As long as there was a present, there was no past. He updated the product, talked to users, went to Berlin for a conference, where he met 2 potential partners from the Netherlands. Everything was going well. Bridgeword was growing. Dennis was cordial, attentive, sometimes almost like before. One evening in May they sat together in a bar on Nowy Świat, drinking beer, and Dennis said, "Listen, have you ever thought about an exit?" Mark looked up. "In what sense?" "Well, if a serious strategic buyer came along, made an offer, you could sell your share and start something new." "No," Mark said simply. "This is my idea. I don't sell ideas." Dennis nodded, smiled, changed the subject. It was a test. Mark only understood that afterward. June passed strangely. Dennis began pressing the point that Mark wasn't attending to investor relations, that he was too focused on the product and wasn't thinking about business strategy. At one meeting with advisors he said gently, almost in passing, that sometimes product-focused founders get in the way of scaling. The advisors nodded. Mark said nothing. At home that evening he opened the shareholders' agreement. Found Clause 11.3. Read it carefully. In the event that one co-founder systematically fails, over a period of 12 months, to fulfill the obligations assigned to him in the area of business development and investor relations, as specified in Appendix 3, the other co-founder shall be entitled to initiate a compulsory buyout procedure at nominal value. Mark read it again, then again. Appendix 3 was written so that most of what Mark actually did fell outside his assigned obligations in any formal sense. And what he didn't do was in them. Dennis had been building this for a year. Methodically, patiently. Mark closed the laptop and sat on the windowsill. Outside, rain was falling. Warsaw reflected in the puddles. Upside down, wet, unmistakable. He thought about his father, about Zenon, about how easy it is to deceive a man who wants to trust. Chapter 6. The Hunt, in which the hunter is not who you expect. For the next 3 weeks Mark lived in 2 realities. By day, the usual co-founder. Meetings, calls, Slack, coffee. He smiled. He nodded. He answered Dennis's questions about users and metrics. At night, a different person. He found a lawyer. Not Polish, not from his own circle. A Ukrainian attorney named Oksana who specialized in corporate disputes and worked out of Wrocław. She read the agreement and said, "This is brutal work. It's what they call a shotgun clause in an unfair package. But it has holes." "What kind?" "Appendix 3 was never properly ratified. There's a signature but no date. That's a procedural error that could void the entire mechanism." "Is that enough?" "For court, possibly. For negotiation, certainly." "What else?" Oksana paused. "We need evidence that this buyout was planned in advance. Correspondence, meetings with third parties, financial documents you weren't supposed to see." Mark nodded and began to look. Greg Majewski entered this story as a background character whom, in truth, no one had noticed. 42 years old. A quiet Pole from Poznan who owned several small IT companies and had a reputation as someone who acquired stakes in early-stage startups. Cheaply, sometimes unpleasantly. Mark had met him once at an event. Hadn't remembered him. But in Dennis's correspondence, the kind Mark happened to see on an open laptop in the office when Dennis stepped out for coffee, Greg's name flickered up twice. Mark photographed the screen. Quietly, without blinking. That was the first brick. Then there was the bookkeeper's secretary, Jadwiga, an older woman with close-cropped hair and a phenomenal memory for detail. Mark had never overlooked people in invisible positions. He remembered their birthdays, asked after their grandchildren, brought coffee without being asked. Jadwiga had once told him, "You're the only one in management who says hello by name." When Mark carefully asked her about certain payment orders, she produced a folder, asking no questions. The second brick. The third came from Berlin. One of the potential Dutch partners wrote to Mark directly. "Heard you're in the process of structuring a deal with some Polish buyer. Is that true? We'd like to understand who we're actually negotiating with." Mark wrote back, "First I've heard of it. Tell me more." The details matched. 3 bricks. Enough for a wall. In parallel, something happened that he hadn't expected. Asia called. He saw her name on the screen and for several seconds just looked at the phone. Then he answered. "Hi," she said. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Hi." A pause. "I heard from mutual friends that you're having problems with your partner." "Heard? Or no?" Another pause. Longer. "Dennis called me several times in the last few weeks. He said..." She stopped. "He said he was worried about you, that you were under stress and making bad decisions." Mark closed his eyes. "He asked you to keep tabs on me?" "No. He asked me to talk to you, so that you'd calm down. Stop asking unnecessary questions." "And you called." "I called," she said, "because I thought you should know." The silence between them was different from before. Not empty. Charged. "Thank you," he said at last. "Mark." "Yes. I was wrong. When I left the way I did. I was afraid everything would fall apart, and I decided to leave first. That was cowardice, not wisdom." He said nothing. "You don't have to respond right now," she added. "Just know that." The call ended. Mark sat with the phone in his hand for a long time, then put it in his pocket and went back to the documents. First things first. After that, we'll see. Chapter 7. The blow. The kind you deliver once. The night before the final conversation, Mark didn't sleep. Not from fear. It was just that his thoughts were moving too fast, too clearly, the way they sometimes do toward morning, when exhaustion stops being exhaustion and becomes something almost like lucidity. He thought about his father, about how he'd sat at the table with his untouched tea. He thought, you won't do it the way he did. You won't just sit there. At 9 in the morning he wrote to Dennis, "We need to talk. Tonight. The apartment, not the office." Dennis replied quickly, "Okay." Dennis arrived at 8. In a good suit with a bottle of wine, as if it were an ordinary evening between partners. Mark opened the door, let him in, didn't take the wine. "Did you make anything to eat?" Dennis asked, glancing toward the kitchen. "No." A pause. Dennis understood the evening was different. They sat down at the table. Mark placed a printout in front of him, the correspondence, payment documents, a screenshot of the Dutch partner's letter. Dennis looked at it, picked up one sheet, Set it down. You actually collected all this? Yes. Mark. He leaned back in his chair. This isn't what you think it is. Then explain to me what it is. Dennis was quiet. For a long time, Mark looked at him and waited. And then something unexpected happened. Dennis didn't deny it. All right, he said at last. All right. You want honesty, let's have honesty. He poured himself some water, set down the glass, began to speak slowly, almost wearily. Do you know how old I am? 38. 38. I don't have children because I spent 10 years on businesses that collapsed. I lost my first startup at 26. Put in everything I had and everything my parents had. The second at 31. I don't feel sorry for myself, no. But I understood one thing, good ideas are nothing. Nothing. The one who wins is the one with structure. The one with control. That's an explanation, said Mark. Not a justification. I'm not justifying myself. Dennis looked at him directly. You were useful to me as a point of entry. You know how to build trust with people. I don't. You gave the project a soul. But you don't know how to protect what you've built. You sign things without reading them. You trust where you should be cautious. Business doesn't forgive softness. Mark. I'm not soft. You're kind. That's different. Kind people lose. I haven't lost. Dennis looked again at the printouts. Procedural error in Appendix 3, said Mark. Missing date. That voids the entire buyout mechanism. Oksana Petrenko from Wrocław, if you'd like. I can give you her contact. Something shifted in Dennis's face. Furthermore, Mark continued, the correspondence with Greg is dated 3 weeks before you told me about the deal. That's a fiduciary breach. That's no longer a procedural matter, that's litigation. International arbitration, to be precise, because one of the investors is Dutch, and our jurisdiction is mixed. Silence. Dennis stood up, went to the window, stared at the street. What do you want? He asked at last. Reinstatement of my share. Full control over the product. You stay in business development without the right to unilaterally initiate transactions above 50,000. Everything enshrined in a new agreement, drafted by Oksana. And if I refuse, then we go to arbitration and you lose considerably more than I do. A long pause. And Greg? Dennis asked. Greg exits the deal. Or you exit the company. Dennis turned around. There was something in his face that Mark had never seen there before. Not anger, not calculation. Something resembling respect. Grudging through gritted teeth, but respect. You've changed, Dennis said. No, Mark answered. I was always like this. You just weren't looking. Dennis would have agreed. Mark could feel it. The conversation was moving toward a point where his partner would simply have no good options left. But that was precisely when Dennis did something Mark hadn't anticipated. He reached for the laptop on the table. I want to make sure the files are in order, he said. Just to check. Don't touch the laptop. Mark, this is a work matter. I said don't touch it. Something snapped. Mark couldn't identify exactly what. That moment when negotiations end and something else begins. The instant of transition that afterward can never be explained rationally. Dennis grabbed the laptop. Mark caught his arm. A second of tension, and then Dennis's fist found his face. Mark fell. The table, the glass of water onto the floor, shattered. Dennis stood over him, breathing hard, laptop in hand, with the expression of a man who had just done something he already regretted. Dennis, said Mark from the floor, wiping blood from his lip. His voice was level. There's nothing on there that will help you. All the documents are already with Oksana. The laptop is just a laptop. A pause. You did that deliberately, Dennis said quietly. Yes. Dennis set the laptop on the table. Slowly. Put on his jacket. Walked to the door. Stopped. I genuinely believed you wouldn't manage without me, he said, without turning around. I believed that. I know, said Mark. That's why I won. The door closed. Chapter 8. The Splinter. Mark sat on the kitchen floor for another 20 minutes or so. His right eye was swelling shut. His lower lip split. On the floor, shards of glass. Outside, Warsaw wasn't sleeping. Then he stood up. Not on the first attempt. On the second, he managed. He found a broom, swept up the shards, made tea, sat down at the table, the same one at which, an hour ago, the fate of 3 years of his life had been decided. Opened the laptop. Wrote to Oksana, we can start the procedure. Wrote to the Dutch partner. The situation is being resolved. Ready to meet next week. Then he looked at his phone for a long time. Called Asia. She picked up immediately, as though she'd been waiting. Is everything all right? She asked. No, he said honestly. But it will be. She didn't say anything wise. Didn't suggest meeting. She simply stayed on the line. He could hear her breathing and the sound of cars outside her window, wherever she was. That was enough. A week later he went to Krakow. Alone. Without a plan. He simply bought a bus ticket on Friday evening and arrived Saturday morning, when the city was still drowsy and empty. He walked to the Vistula embankment. That place, he'd remembered it since childhood. Stone steps down to the water, old poplars, the smell of the river. He sat on the steps. The morning was gray, quiet, with that particular autumn light that makes everything feel slightly more real. The water moved slowly. A single yellow leaf drifted on the surface. Just drifting, unhurried, without direction. Mark watched it for a long time. He didn't know what would come next. Didn't know whether Bridgeword would turn out the way he wanted. Didn't know whether things would work out with Asia, or whether anything would work out at all. He didn't know whether he'd become a different person or had always been this person. Just never had reason to find out. He knew one thing, he had gotten up. Not because anyone had helped him. Not because it had gotten easier. He simply got up because it was the only thing that made sense to do. The leaf on the water turned around a bend and disappeared from sight. Mark took out his phone. Wrote to his father, "Hey Dad, it's been a while. How are you?" Put the phone in his pocket. Stood up. Walked on. Not toward a finish line, just forward. Sometimes that's enough. The end.